Okay, so we'll make a start. So thank you very much for everyone for joining. We've got a lot of interest in this webinar, and it will be recorded and then put on the college website so that you can refer back to it, or for those people that weren't able to be there today. So we've been running webinars ahead of sort of ST4 self-assessment portfolio upload for a few sessions now, just so that you have the opportunity to just really go through the criteria for your applications for ST4, and then also to be able to ask any questions that you have generally relating to self-assessment, which we will answer some of them in the Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We won't be able to answer individual, very specific details, because obviously we won't be able to see your portfolio. But if there are any general questions, then please do ask them. So I'm going to start off with some information and just go through the criteria and any changes that we've introduced for this year for August 25 applications. And then Drew will carry on by telling you some general information about the stats and information from the previous rounds that we've got information on. So you're probably aware, and I hope most of you, if not all of you, have looked on the ANRO website, because all the documents relating to the recruitment process for ST4 are up there live for the August 25 recruitment round. And there you'll find the applicant handbook, plus the specific documents related to self-assessment, as well as a lot of other useful information. So you may be aware that self-assessment scoring, it may be used for shortlisting. So after you've submitted your portfolio and it's been assessed and the final score has been agreed, if we hope to be able to interview everyone, but if there's depending on the number of applicants, if there's a large number of applicants, then the score will be used for shortlisting. And overall, it goes up to 55 points with the portfolio organisation score. And so it's added to the interview score to give a total score. So the self-assessment on average is about a third of the overall score. So just some general points. It's really important that you do refer to the self-assessment grid with all the criteria, and also look at the guidance document and the separate portfolio organisation document carefully. Every year we seem to have, when we're looking at reviews particularly, some applicants that don't appear to have actually looked at the documents, and therefore they've scored themselves incorrectly. Most of the queries related to your evidence will be answered in these documents, but if you're not sure, then it's really important that you ask a supervisor or your college tutor or your TPD for advice about how to score, and what evidence you need to put on your portfolio to justify that score. Please don't contact ANRO or the college directly about specific points relating to your application. Also remember that some of you may have applied before, and obviously some of you, this will be your first time that you've applied. If you have applied before, we don't have any access to any previous portfolios or applications, and the criteria will have changed slightly from round to round. So in a new thing this year, we're asking applicants to put a one-page document for each of the domains, just summarising your evidence and justifying the score. Some people have already been doing this on previous rounds, and the assessors have found this particularly useful, as it gives us an idea of why you've given yourself so many points. It doesn't need to be long, and it won't be counted as one piece of evidence in the number of uploads that you're allowed. So if you just say, for instance, in audit, I have scored myself 4 points because I have been the lead for how many projects, and I've got this evidence there. So if you can do that briefly for each of the domains, that is incredibly helpful. Ideally, if you can put all the evidence for each domain in one single PDF, that's very helpful, because it then means the assessors don't have to keep opening and closing lots of different documents. However, one single PDF is not one piece of evidence. In depending on what's in it, there will still be multiple bits of evidence in the PDF. If you look at the portfolio organisation score document, it tells you exactly the number of documents that you're allowed per domain and gives a bit more detail into what actually is allowed. So please do look at that. We're aware that obviously the applications are open currently, but then they will close, and then there will be a time period of a few weeks before you actually have to upload your evidence onto the portfolio. So if you do accrue additional evidence from your initial application, you can then add it to the portfolio with a note as to say, I've done this since I made my initial application. Please could my score be increased? And this is, the evidence that I've submitted. Just remember, all the assessors are consultants and anaesthetists, and a lot of them will have sort of training roles when we assess your portfolios. It does take an assessor roughly 60 minutes for each portfolio to review. So if you make it easier for them to score, then we will find that very helpful. Thank you. Also, there is a time period, and it does take time to upload lots of documents. So please don't leave it to the last minute and make it rushed, because if that happens, then you might, not upload things in a very orderly fashion, or you might forget to upload pieces of evidence. So we're aware, obviously, that we produce the criteria and we give some guidance as to, what sort of things are included, but there will be some people that their evidence doesn't fit neatly into each of the domain. If that is the case, and you feel that when you've read the guidance document and the criteria that your piece of evidence is similar to the domain but doesn't fit exactly, then you should still submit it, but write an explanation as to what it is, because if it's something that's, say, particularly if it's been done abroad, overseas, then the assessor may not be aware of exactly what it is. Obviously, we want to give you the points for your portfolio, so that you get the points that you should have. So please just write a little bit of detail in your portfolio as to what this piece of evidence is, and what how involved you've been with it, how long it's taken you to do it, etc. And if there are links, particularly to websites, particularly for things like domain 10, where there's a lot of varied evidence, then the assessor can then make a decision when they assess your portfolio. So also very useful for us is a separate letter for evidence. So you can ask your supervisor or your college tutor to just give you a letter of support confirming that what your evidence is. This letter is available on the ANRO website as a download. You can have more than one for each, you can use it for separate pieces of evidence in different domains. And then that is also helpful for the assessor to be able to sort of see how your evidence fits in. So what are the changes for August 25 and February 26? So these rounds, we won't be changing the criteria between August 25 and 26. They'll stay the same, and the guidance document will stay the same. But we have made a few small changes for these years, so which we'll go through just now. So I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but you'll see from the ANRO website and the criteria that domain 1 is additional degrees and qualifications, and you get more points for having higher degrees, particularly MDs, PhDs. Although not many people will get points for those points, but you may have things like a MRCP or other postgraduate medical qualifications. So please check the guidance document to see where they would fit into your portfolio. The changes that we've made to the criteria based on feedback is that now we've updated the emergency medicine exams so that part 1 of the MRChem scores 2 points and all points score 3 points. And we've removed leadership qualifications that were originally in domain 1 to domain 10 because we felt that they fitted better in that domain. So just a few points for domain 1. Sometimes things like certificates and masters are difficult for the assessors to work out your score. So if you could write an explanation, if it's not very clear, for instance, how long you've taken to do this particular piece of evidence, how it's been assessed, etc., that can be very helpful. If it's a university degree, then how many credits you've got for it. Despite putting it in the guidance document, every time we get queries, and people do put in anaesthetic and ICM exams, but none of these exams will count for points in domain 1. And this also applies to international anaesthetic and ICM exams. Intercalated degrees do not gain any points. These were taken out by MDRS a few years ago. And an MD as part of standard anaesthetic training does not gain any points. It has to be something that is a standalone extra, and guidance is given on the guidance document for that. We would request that you put in any certificates for qualifications where you're requesting points, but things like certificates for, say, your primary medical degree, you don't need to upload. Next slide, please. So it is vital that you attach to domain 1 your CV or a timeline. If you don't attach it, it means that the assessor can't work out where your evidence fits into your career. So they can't they can't work out, for instance, what other experience in other specialties you've done, or for instance, when you've done audits, etc., if you don't attach a CV. It should list all of your posts that you've done since qualification as a doctor and account for any gaps. If you don't upload your CV or timeline, unfortunately, you will get 1 point deducted from the portfolio organisation score. Next slide, please, Drew. So moving on to domain 2, which is additional achievements, prizes and awards relating to medicine. You can see the criteria there. We haven't changed it for this round. We changed it a couple of rounds back because we had to remove undergraduate prizes from this criteria based on MDRS feedback. Next slide, please. So as I said, undergraduate prizes don't gain any points now, but we have included prizes that you might be awarded locally in your hospital or regionally or nationally. If you have just got an email that confirms your award, then we won't accept that as evidence. If that's the only evidence you have, it needs to be a letter of confirmation from your ES or college tutor, sort of filling in one of those letters that I showed you earlier. There are specific prizes for the primary FRCA, only a couple awarded every round. These are specific prizes, but if you do have one of those, then you will gain points. But we won't give points if you've got a high score in one part of the primary. And no points are gained for any bursary awards. Next slide, Drew, please. So moving on to domain 3, which is postgraduate experience in other specialties. So you need to look at this carefully to see where your evidence pertains to and to work out how many points you should be requesting. For instance, if you've done 12 months ACCS, you will automatically have done 6 months medicine and 6 months emergency medicine. So you should get a minimum of 2 points, but you need to read the guidance document to see what things you need to put in there to make sure that you've got the expected outcomes. If you don't have expected outcomes, then you'll get lower points than if you do. And we have clarified what sort of things we would expect to see for expected outcomes in the document, in the guidance documents. So the only changes are for 2 points, we've changed it from more than 36 months to more than 12 months without evidence of expected outcomes for 2 points. Next slide. So the other point to make is that you can count up to 12 months of additional ICM, but this needs to be addition to your stage 1 trainings, because obviously you get 6 months of ICM as part of stage 1 training. So it has to be in addition to this. And in the past, it's not been always very easy for the assessor to see exactly how much someone has done in ICM, particularly if you've done ICM abroad, to make sure that that is clear in your portfolio application. In the past, people have lost points if they didn't include evidence of expected outcomes. And also applicants have lost points if the dates were inaccurate for when you upload this information relating to when the assessors looked at your CV and timeline. So make sure they both tally and they both are the same. This is the only domain 3, that you can have more than 4 pieces of evidence per domain if you've done multiple posts, and therefore you need to upload more than 4 pieces of evidence. So quality improvement projects, again, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. The way that people sometimes lose marks is if they don't have evidence of exactly their role in the project, if you've been the lead or the co-lead, and also whether there's clear evidence that you've made recommendations to practice or close the audit loops. Again, this is a domain where the supervisor letter can be particularly useful. You must also include your PowerPoint slides or equivalent for any projects you've been involved in. Sadly, some applicants in the last round lost points or got no points in this section because they didn't include these. So make sure you do include these. And as I said before, assessor will check your timeline to see when your particular project fits in relating to your career, so whether it's done before or during stage 1 training particularly. Research, we've made a slight change for this. I'm not going to go through it all, but the change that we have made is for 3 points. You used to be able to gain points if you had enrolled in a associate principal investigator scheme. We felt that this was unfair because applicants could have just started and basically not done anything in the role. So now for 3 points for this, you need to have completed it. So you'll need to put the evidence to show that you have completed this scheme if that's part of your evidence. Also, some people have lost points in the past by putting audits into this section when it should have been put in the audit section. So make sure the evidence that you're uploading is relating to research. And particularly useful is the letter of evidence for your role or how much you've done, how many people you've enrolled into research projects, etc. Majority of applicants in the last few rounds did show fairly good evidence, and it's one of the domains where review is not very commonly requested. So we're moving on to teaching now. So a lot of people do gain points in teaching, which is good. But to gain the most points, we put in the guidance document exactly what it is a major contribution to regional or national teaching programme. So those have to be events where there are people attending from outside or from the region or nationally, and it has to be more than one event. It has to be a series of events, and also it needs to be of a particular time period, and we've clarified this further in the guidance document. We've also added for 2 points, leadership positions in education. So for instance, if you're a teaching fellow or you're a sim fellow or something equivalent, you may be able to gain points in this domain, but you need to just write a brief summary of the role and what you've done as a teaching fellow, so that we can see that you've not just been appointed and you've only just been started, but that you actually had some role in improving education, training and teaching in your trust. It's particularly useful for any type of teaching, but particularly for the higher points, the 4 and 5 points, that if you add in a program of the teaching that you've done, so that we can see how long the teaching events happened. Some people get a bit confused about teaching in a large trust. So there are obviously large trusts in the UK, and some have multiple sites. So if you're teaching just in your trust but people attending from different sites, that would not be counted as regional. That is still local teaching. So academic publications, I'm not going to go through it all, but you can read the criteria. Again, we haven't made any changes this time. Anything that you upload has to be either PubMed listed or peer reviewed. The assessors will go and check on PubMed to see where your where your evidence is. If it's not PubMed listed, you can still gain points provided it's peer reviewed, but you need to put evidence of the journal where you've had your publication accepted or published, so that we can see that it is a peer reviewed publication. We know that it takes quite a long time now from doing your publication and submitting it, and perhaps having to have it sent back and make some amendments. So you can still get points if your publication hasn't been published yet, but it's been accepted, provided it's now in the final stage and it's not still in draft. Some applicants in the last round or two did put in very small surveys that have been published, but these don't score points. And obviously any publications need to be relevant to medicine. I'm aware that people do lots of things outside of medicine that's very good, and you might be able to get points for those in domain 10, but publications in this domain need to be relevant to medicine. So presentations, sometimes this does cause a bit of confusion for the 4, 5, and 6 points. So any poster presentation at a regional, national, or international meeting will gain 4 points, provided the evidence has been uploaded. Some conferences, meetings include posters being displayed where the assessors for the posters come around and you have to give a 5-minute presentation in front of your poster. We don't count that as an oral presentation, only a poster presentation. To count as an oral presentation, it has to be a presentation where you've stood up in an auditorium in front of an audience, and that would be counting as an oral presentation. Some people ask us if I've attended the meeting as well as presented my poster, can that count as an event in domain 9? Yes, it can, provided you've got the evidence that you've attended the meeting as well as the poster presentations. And all presentations must have been given, not just accepted. So unfortunately, there's always going to be a cut-off for that. You actually have to have given the presentation. So continuing professional development, we haven't changed this. We changed it a few years back to reflect the stage 1 curriculum, where there is a big emphasis on simulation and regional anaesthesia. So please read the guidance document carefully to make sure that you know what is included for this domain. If your certificate might be obvious to you as to how long it was or how many hours it was, but the assessor may not know. So if it doesn't say in your certificate how many CPD points were awarded or how many hours it was, then you must upload the program so that the assessor can give you the correct points. And all certificates must be in date at the time of upload, so that we can give you the correct amount of points. The only other change we've made to this is to just clarify exactly what is meant by mandatory training, and that is in the guidance document. So domain 10 is one of the domains where we were getting the most requests for reviews. And it's not surprising really, because obviously it's leadership and management and it might be outside of medicine, and you all do lots of interesting, exciting things, but it meant that it's sometimes quite difficult to score. So we've revised this criteria just to make it a bit clearer, we hope, so that you get more points as a postgraduate, and then more points as a postgraduate regionally and then nationally. So for 2 points, you can get points if you have had a leadership role in your trust, for instance, as a postgraduate. For instance, if you are your trust not teaching leave, that wouldn't count here. If you were, say, your resident doctors forum lead, if you're wellbeing lead or audit lead, something like that, or you manage the rotas, then you would potentially be able to get 2 points. So we've given a bit more information about that in the guidance document. It's very important that so that the assessor can see exactly where your evidence fits in, particularly if it's something outside of medicine, that you just give some information about exactly what your role has been, how long you've been doing it, and letter from sort of the people that you've been working with that particularly helpful. So we'll just move on to, so just to let you know, and this is on the ANRO website as well, for anyone that needs to reapply for August 26, so that's in another 12 months, we have agreed with MDRS that points for undergraduate degrees will be being removed from Domain 1. This is in kin with a lot of other specialties that haven't included undergraduate degrees for quite a long time. So we are just giving advance notice that this will be the situation for August 26. Next slide, please. So in addition to 50 points from the actual self-assessment, you can get 5 points from the portfolio organisation score. We introduced this after self-assessment went online during the pandemic, because in the initial rounds, we found that a huge amount of evidence was being uploaded, and sometimes it was very difficult for the assessor to find it. Sometimes whole theses were being uploaded or whole portfolios. So we've given some guidance now for portfolio organisation. So the principle is that everyone will start off with 5 points, and then you only get deductions if there are various things like certificates are out of date, or you've exceeded the amount of documents upload per domain. Most people, when you'll see the evidence that Drew will show you in a minute, most people do get 5 points, and the majority will get 4 or 5 points for this, but you should try be aiming to get full 5 points. The other change is that you've now been able to appeal this. So from August 24 onwards, if you feel that your portfolio organisation score has been deducted unfairly, then you can appeal it. So I think we're moving on to Drew now, who's going to take over from me to do the rest of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Nikki. And from me, good evening as well. I'm going to go over a little bit of the previous scores. We've obviously been doing this for a few years now, and we are getting more and more information, which can be helpful for some people. Not everybody, but it can definitely be helpful for some people to look and see what applicants have scored in the past. So just to note, the round, which is literally is just finished, or is just in the process of finishing, 323 applicants applied to commence in February 2025. Of those, 310 were longlisted, and then 303 portfolios were reviewed and scored. What's perhaps more relevant to you, because you'll be applying for the bigger round, round 2, there were 640 applicants last year. Again, 621 were longlisted, and 609 portfolios were reviewed and scored. And as Nikki has already said, the portfolios are all reviewed and scored by very experienced assessors, people who've been involved in as consultants in training to different levels, but everybody enjoys doing what they do, and you know, it is good to see what you're all doing to support your applications. What I want to do is just have a little look at some of the overall scoring. We'll look at the individual domains, and then we'll think particularly about the number of appeals and which domains are appealed. Some of this information will come from the most recent round, round 3. Some of it comes from round 2. I only received the information from ANRO fairly recently, so we haven't had an opportunity to have a really good look at it. But as I say, hopefully you will still find this useful. So what we did was, this is the round 2, so for August last year. So you can see there the applicant scores and then the verified scores, and that was final verified scores after reviews had taken place. So they are clustering round about the sort of 25 to 34, 35-ish. We'll get a few with quite a bit more, and also a few less. So the majority of people are scoring round about sort of the 25 to 35 mark. Looking at the applicant scores versus the verified scores for round 2, we found that just over a third of people actually scored, after their score was verified, they scored less than they had scored themselves. Over a third scored the same, and then just under a quarter actually scored greater than what they'd scored themselves. You can see there the variations. So those that scored less, the variations did vary up to 22 points. The number of points for those that scored greater was only up to 7. But it is worth, when you submit your scores, we will have a look as assessors at what you submit, and then decide whether what it scores. And sometimes it definitely does push your score up a little bit. So let's look at the individual domain scores, and then I've got some comparisons for the last 4 rounds for that. So that's looking at from August 23-24, and then right up until the recruitment round that starts in February 20, where people will commence working in February 25. So you'll see there that the majority of people for additional degrees, a lot of people are scoring no points or 2 points. There are very few who are up there with a full MD or PhD. But there are a considerable number as well who have something additional, for example, the MRCP. This gives you a good idea, I think, of where things are scored and where you fit into that scoring. Prizes and awards, there's quite a good range here. I think you can see there in August 24, and for this round as well, the introduction of awards, for example, like Greatix, really did make a big difference, and there was a big jump there in the number of applicants who were receiving 2 points. And obviously, the majority of people there are receiving 2 points or less in this domain. But anything that you score in this round, if you submit it, then we will have a look and see where it fits in to the criteria. Again, clinical experience. I think a lot of people have done some other clinical experience before they come into anaesthetics. Anecdotally, since I've been involved in the recruitment process for many years, and a lot of people used to come straight from foundation, and the majority of people are not coming from foundation now. But as Nikki has stressed, it's really important that if you have done posts, if you've undertaken other posts, that you need to give us evidence that you've met the educational outcomes. For example, for those that have done ACCS, you're an outcome 1 at ARCP for your medicine and your acute medicine and your emergency medicine. That is appropriate evidence to show that you've met all the expected outcomes. But if you've done posts in other places, you need to have a think about the type of evidence that you can supply to show that you've met the educational needs. You can still gain points, but you'll get fewer points. And again, a lot of people clustering around about the 2 and 3 mark here. Quality improvement. Given that quality improvement is part of your stage 1 training, we would expect the majority of people to be able to score well in this. Again, as Nikki pointed out, sometimes if people forget to include, for example, a PowerPoint presentation, then they will potentially not get the marks that they should be getting. But you can see there that nearly a third of people are actually getting 6 points in this domain, which is fantastic. Research, less so. A lot of people will find that they don't get a huge amount of opportunity during stage 1 training to undertake research. and that's why we have this bigger cluster around about 2 and 3 marks. But a lot of people are participating in some ways in research, particularly in those national projects where they are able to recruit patients to a research project. So if you've got that information, you've got that evidence, then that will definitely be able to score you points in this domain. The teaching domain is quite a challenge. You can see there there's a big cluster around about 2 and then another bigger cluster round about 5. Interestingly, a very small number of people, mainly in August 23, but even in August 24 last year, had nothing for teaching, had no evidence to submit for teaching. Teaching is part of the stage 1 training, and therefore most people should be able to get at least 1 point here. But as I say, big clusters around about 2 and 5. One of the challenges that we have in this domain is being able to assess exactly what your role has been, because not everybody puts in as clear evidence as others, and that can be a challenge. Without exceeding the amount of evidence for each domain, then you should think very, very carefully about the best evidence that you can put in to show us what you've done from a teaching point of view. Publications, again, a lot of people will not be able to get publications, unfortunately, and that's reflected in the number of people who don't score any points in this domain. However, again, there's a nice spread of points over the domain as a whole. Again, very, very importantly, you must be able to demonstrate as whether you were lead author, for example, you must be able to demonstrate whether it's a peer-reviewed journal. I think an increasing number of people are submitting evidence for publications not PubMed listed, but if they are peer-reviewed, then they score exactly the same number of points, but we need to have evidence for that. We did actually get asked this year about submission for things like the bulletin, and I think if you have a publication for something like the bulletin, then you should submit it. And then once we have evidence of what your involvement is, then your assessor will be able to look at that. Presentations, again, with the introduction to the poster presentations, you can see there that nearly 2/3 of people are scoring 4, with far fewer scoring 5 or 6. It is really important to differentiate between what you would do to gain 4 points and then what you would do to gain 5 or 6. The vast majority of people for 5 or 6 we would expect to be listed on a programme as a presenter for an actual conference, but you need to put in the information for that. CPD, there was a long discussion about CPD at previous recruitment committee meetings, because CPD again should be something that should be fairly easy for everybody to get 5 points. Just remember, we continue to have people who submit more than 4 pieces of evidence. We have those who don't. The evidence for statutory and mandatory training can be a little bit challenging. We've tried, as Nikki has pointed out, to make that clear. So, for example, courses which are a part of the IAC are not considered statutory and mandatory, and they will not score you points. Statutory and mandatory training is things like fire safety training or equality and diversity. There are some units where they make specific courses mandatory, but these again would not count. We're looking here more at courses where every single doctor coming to work in the trust would undertake those courses. The last domain, the leadership domain, is by far the most challenging one for us to assess. And I'm sure for many of you it will be a challenge to think about the type of evidence that you produce for this. We've tried to make the guidance as clear as possible, but obviously we cannot legislate for every single component or every single thing that people could submit for this domain. So have a look at it, speak to an educational supervisor or a college tutor about the best type of evidence. In the past, we've had people who submit a picture of them having obviously done something like a run with a medal. That isn't really a good piece of evidence because it doesn't tell us what you've done. So think very carefully about this domain. But you'll see there that a significant number of people are scoring relatively highly in this domain. This is just looking at the global rating score, and then as it became the portfolio organisation score, and the majority of people are scoring 6 in this domain. What we see is that people, it's actually the majority of people are scoring 5 because I put the wrong scale on here. It is possible, and I apologise for that. It is possible in this domain to score 0. So the score along the x-axis should actually be 0 to 5, not 1 to 6. Sorry, that is my mistake. But you'll see there that the majority of people score 5 points. What we say to assessors is that everybody should start with 5, and then if they do things which the guidance shows they shouldn't do, then that may reduce some points. So you can see there that the majority of people, as I've said, are scoring well in this. If you put in out of date information or too many items, and again, I have seen people where they've submitted 7 courses, for example, and therefore that quite clearly exceeds the number of items. The only domain where you can put in more than 4 pieces of evidence is the clinical experience domain, and that's because if you've done more than 4 posts, you'll want to include information about all of the posts. As you already know, I'm sure there is an opportunity to request a review. So once you submit your evidence, it is assessed by a consultant, and then a score is given. You can ask for a review of that score if you don't agree with it. And in round 2, this time last year, 132 applicants requested a review. Now, of those, 17 were the portfolio organisation score only. So last year for round 2 was the first time that anybody could appeal the score. And quite correctly, people appropriately did appeal it. Excluding the portfolio organisation score, 169 domains were reviewed. One of the things that we did notice is that sometimes assessors didn't count extra evidence from the applicant between their own score and then uploading the evidence. And that's really important, that if you have submitted evidence to support a higher score than your initial application, and that hasn't been scored, then that would be appropriate for you to request a review. And this just looks at the number of reviews per applicant. So the majority of people were asking for a single review, but you'll see there that we had up to 4 reviews. The reviews are always undertaken by people who have a great deal of experience in this. It's nearly always people like regional advisors, training programme directors, senior members of the recruitment committee, or college tutors. So people who are involved in training. Looking at the number of reviews per domain, you'll see there that domain 10, the leadership, is the one which generates the largest number of reviews, and then just behind that is the teaching domain. The publications is the smallest number, and that's mainly because you've either got a publication or you don't, and therefore that's a little bit more difficult to request a review. This just looks at the request for reviews, including the pause, and you'll see there that actually a lot of people did ask for a pause review as well, simply because they were scored down in the pause, perhaps for a reason that they didn't necessarily agree with. And just looking at that a little bit more in detail, so there were 52 requests looking at the portfolio organisation score. So that was 8.5% of applicants asked for a review. And of those, 31 actually had their portfolio organisation score increased, and 21 stayed the same as the original assessor. And you'll see there that was a change in the scores after verification of the scores in total. So you'll see very few changed majorly. 132 applicants, requested a review, and about a third remained unchanged, but very importantly, 2 assessed scores were actually reduced after verification. And that's always a possibility, that you may ask for a review and your score actually gets reduced even more. But the majority of cases that did not happen. It's really important that you request a review if you feel that your evidence has not been assessed, or people haven't noticed things in your assessment. You need to be really specific on why your score needs to be adjusted. What is really important, as Nikki has already said, we cannot see your applications from previous rounds. And there's always people who say, well, I scored this in a previous round. We don't have access to your scores from previous rounds, and therefore we wouldn't use that necessarily as a reason to adjust your score. For diplomas and certificates, a description of the course, the number of credits, how it was assessed, that's really, really important. You cannot submit further evidence when you request a review. So we did notice that in the most recent round, that there were some people who said when they were asked for a review, I can submit this evidence, I can submit that. Unfortunately, you cannot do that. The evidence that you submit at the time of the document upload, that is it. Further evidence cannot be considered. And after a review, the final decision of the review panel is final. So in preparation for ST4 self-assessments, it's really important to keep an eye on the web pages of the college website, and that will tell you about that will give you information about the application process. It talks about the recruitment functions of all the different organisations involved. Some people, for example, are not sure about MDRS. That is a component of Health Education England, and they are the body who are responsible for recruitment to every single medical specialty across the United Kingdom. And when they ask us to change criteria, then we have to change the criteria. Nikki and I, as has already been mentioned, are involved in the recruitment committee. A huge amount of work is put in by the committee to try and ease the process of recruitment and try and make it as clear as possible. I'm just going to finish off with a couple of wee slides about the self-assessment evidence portal. We were hoping to get somebody from Anro, but unfortunately nobody was able to join us today. And these are all slides which are taken from the document which is on the Anro website. So if you look, you will on the Anro website, you will see this information here, and all these slides are taken from that. So the self-assessment portal, you will be given a username and password, and you need to be able to log in, obviously, to present your evidence. It will ask you about the specialties page, and you'll see up on the left-hand side of the screen your Oriel PIN number, and then you'll have a dashboard. And that will give you information about what you're applying for. Obviously, from our point of view, what you're applying for, and these slides are old, it will not be anaesthetic ST3, it will be anaesthetics ST4. There is an opportunity to upload your evidence, and you'll see that this gives you information about the types of formats which are supported, and the size of files that you can submit. As Nikki has said, and we'll stress again, we are really keen to encourage everybody to put just a single page document in that explains why you've awarded yourselves the points for a particular domain. And the other thing that you can use that for, if you've got a particularly large document, it's useful that you can actually tell us where within the document we will be able to find the evidence. So, for example, you know, the main piece of evidence is on page 10 of this document. If you can provide anything which helps the assessor review the evidence as easily as possible, then that will be really, really helpful. And you can actually edit your evidence once you've submitted it, and you can change things like the domain tags. So these slides, as I say, are all taken from the document which is on the ANRO website. So please have a look at that. We have been asked to stress by ANRO that you will not be able to log into the self-assessment evidence portal before the document upload window, which commences on Monday the 13th of January. And the document upload window runs until the 20th of January. As I've said already, you cannot provide additional evidence when you ask for a review. All we can do is look at the evidence that you submitted during that document upload window. I hope that you found it a useful presentation, working our way through both this current round and looking at previous rounds. And hopefully now when I come out the slideshow, we'll be able to see lots of questions in the question and answer section.